They seated me in the kitchen at my son's wedding. I thought it was a mistake, until I overheard what they said. That moment didn't just break my heart. It erased me. This isn't just the story of a mother forgotten. It's a lifetime of sacrifice, erased in a single celebration. But this time I didn't fight. I vanished. And what happened next you won't see coming. Watch this story to the end, because some betrayals don't come with slaps or screams. They come with silence. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Or at least the most fulfilling one. A moment when all the years of sacrifice, the nights I spent stitching clothes under a dim bulb while my hands bled from needle pricks, the meals I skipped so my son could eat a little more, the dreams I buried deep within myself so I could pour everything into his. All of it was supposed to make sense that day. My son was getting married. And yet there I was, seated on a cold plastic chair in the kitchen of the venue, the aroma of reheated chicken mingling with the metallic tang of old grease and burnt coffee. Plates clattered beside me and catering staff moved in and out, ignoring my presence as if I were part of the equipment. My name wasn't even on the guest seating chart. Not near the altar. Not even in the back. They said, "Oh, we're so sorry, the list got mixed up," as they ushered me into the kitchen with a smile that didn't reach their eyes. I wanted to believe it was a mistake. But deep down, something in me cracked. Not suddenly, not loudly, but quietly and cruelly, like frost breaking a flower at dawn. My heart didn't scream. Just gave up. I sat there holding a cup of lukewarm tea someone had handed me out of pity, while the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and toasts seeped through the swinging door. I didn't cry. Not yet. Because tears, I had learned, were luxuries I couldn't afford. Not when there were mouths to feed, not when rent was due, not when my only child looked at me with eyes that had stopped seeing me years ago. I remembered the first time I held him in my arms. His tiny fingers had wrapped around mine with such desperate need that I'd made a vow to the universe. I would give him everything. And I did. Even when his father walked out when he was barely a year old, leaving me with nothing but a stained mattress and an empty refrigerator. Even when I had to choose between paying for his asthma medication or buying shoes for myself during winter. I chose him. Always him. I was mother, father, protector, provider, everything. I wore my sacrifices like armor, thinking they would shield me from irrelevance. But armor rusts. And on that day in that kitchen I realized I had rusted completely, forgotten, invisible, discarded like the scraps the servers dumped into bins behind me. I heard someone toast the bride's parents, then the groom's family. I strained to hear if anyone mentioned me. They didn't. Not once. My name, so ordinary, so worn from years of being called when diapers needed changing or bills needed paying, was absent. My son had always been a quiet boy. Sensitive. Needing more love than most. And I gave it endlessly. I still remember sewing superhero patches onto his school bag at night so he wouldn't feel left out. I remember selling my wedding jewelry to buy him a second-hand bicycle. I remember staying up through his fevers, whispering lullabies when he had nightmares. And slowly as he grew I learned to step back. I didn't interfere when he brought girlfriends home. I didn't pry when he stopped calling me mama, and started calling me ma. I smiled when he forgot birthdays. I forgave when he missed Mother's Day. Because I thought love was patient. And it is. But even patience, when trampled on too many times, begins to look like silence. And silence, I learned that day, can be deadly. I stared at the tiny television mounted in the kitchen corner. Played the wedding live feed. There was my son, beaming as he danced with his new bride. Her gown flowed like a river of silk, and his suit was tailored to perfection. He looked radiant. Proud. Complete. And I, the woman who had built his foundation with her bare hands, was reduced to a footnote. No one asked where the groom's mother was. No one cared. I wondered as I sat there what would have happened if I had collapsed. Would someone have found me hours later among the dish bins? Would the catering staff have even noticed a lifeless body slumped against the wall? I didn't feel angry. Anger would have been a comfort, a sign that I still mattered. No, I felt something worse. Emptiness. A vast, echoing hollow inside me where purpose used to live. I thought about walking out, leaving a note, disappearing. But I couldn't even find the energy to move. I was so tired. Not just physically but soul-deep weary, from being everything and still ending up as nothing. The door swung open and someone yelled, "We need more napkins." I flinched, instinctively rising ready to serve before catching myself. That was all I had become, a server. A giver. Never a receiver. I sat back down. They hadn't just put me in the kitchen. They had placed my whole life there. Years of being taken for granted, of being too proud to ask for thanks, had led me to that moment. And what hurt most was knowing I had no one to blame but myself. I had taught them I was invisible. I had trained them to see me as background noise. I thought of my own mother, how I had once judged her for her silence, her endless patience with a father who never acknowledged her. I used to promise myself I'd be different. And now here I was. A shadow. I heard laughter erupt in the hall again, and it struck me how life moved on without even a pause to acknowledge who helped pave the path. I wanted to scream, I'm here. I existed. I mattered. But the words died in my throat. Because truthfully I wasn't sure I did anymore. The pain wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with sobs or hysteria. It was quiet. Bone deep. Like a slow leak in a lifeboat. I sat there staring at the teacup and thought, this is how stories end. Not with tragedy, but with silence. And as the night wore on and the music outside swelled into its final chorus, I made a decision. I wouldn't make a scene. I wouldn't beg for acknowledgement. I wouldn't fight for a place I should have never had to ask for. I would leave. Quietly. Completely. I would disappear from their world like a ghost with no name, and let the absence speak the volumes my voice never could. Because sometimes the most powerful ending isn't loud. It's simply walking away when no one is watching and never turning back. When his father left, I didn't cry, not at first. I remember standing by the window holding my son in one arm and a crumpled note in the other, and staring at the empty street as though the man who had promised forever would somehow turn back, laughing, saying it was all a cruel joke. But he didn't. And in that silence, as the radiator hissed and my baby whimpered against my shoulder, a strange calmness took over me. Not peace, not understanding, but a numb kind of resolve. I was 23, jobless, and holding a life that depended entirely on me. That night, I heated water on the stove because the gas had already been shut off, bathed my son in a plastic basin, and whispered to him that no matter who left, I never would. I didn't know how I would do it, but I knew I had to. The early days were a blur of desperation and small miracles. I knocked on doors for cleaning work, begged the grocery store to let me restock shelves at night, and accepted every humiliating job with a thank you and a smile. There were times I slept standing on the bus to my second shift, balancing my son's carrier between my feet. I learned to make 1 can of beans last 2 days, to mend shoes with dental floss, and to cut my own hair in the mirror to avoid looking like someone who'd given up. But no matter how tired I was, no matter how hungry or broken or scared, I always found the strength to smile when I saw his face. He was my sun, my compass, the reason I kept going when everything in me screamed to stop. I remember the winters most vividly, how the cold seeped into the walls of our one-room apartment like a punishment. I'd heat up towels in the oven, wrap them around him, and pretend we were camping. He thought it was fun. He thought I was magical. I became an expert at hiding struggle behind fairy tales. When the power went out, I lit candles and told him we were on a secret adventure. When he asked why the fridge was empty, I said we were practicing being superheroes who didn't need food to stay strong. And when he cried for his father, when he asked where he had gone and when he would come back, I swallowed my bitterness like poison and said, Daddy had to go on a big mission, but he loves you very much. Because I refused to let my son carry the weight of someone else's failure. I wanted his heart to grow without bitterness, even if it meant mine rotted with it. I celebrated every tiny victory like it was a miracle. The first time he walked. The day he said Mama with his gummy smile. The morning he brought me a daisy he'd picked on the way home from kindergarten. I kept that flower pressed in an old Bible, the only gift I'd received in years. He didn't know that I skipped meals so he could eat. That I wore the same coat for 6 winters while he outgrew his every year. That I cried into my pillow at night because I was so afraid. Afraid of failing him, of not being enough, of what would happen if I got sick or hit my breaking point. But somehow I never did. Because love is strange like that. It makes you stronger than you ever thought possible even when it's killing you slowly. I used to sit by his bedside after long shifts, watching him sleep with one arm thrown across his stuffed bear, and feel this aching gratitude that I got to be his mother. Even when my fingers were cracked and my back screamed from scrubbing toilets all day, I would touch his hair and think, he's worth it. Every second. Every scar. And he was. God, he was. As he grew older, he started noticing things. He noticed that his clothes weren't as new as the other kids. That I never came to school meetings because I was always working. That we didn't have a car and sometimes had to walk in the rain. And I watched the light in his eyes dim little by little. Not because he loved me less, but because he began to understand the cost of our survival. He never complained, never whined. Instead, he tried to help. He'd fold laundry while watching cartoons, bring me my slippers when I came home, and once he even tried to fix the leaky sink with duct tape and YouTube tutorials. I laughed, then cried, then hugged him so tightly he gasped. He was always trying to protect me, even when he was the one who needed protecting. The bond between us wasn't just love, it was survival. We were all each other had, two broken pieces welded together by necessity and fierce devotion. I still remember the day he graduated high school. I bought a used dress from a thrift store, altered it by hand at night, and used old makeup to cover the fatigue in my face. When they called his name and he walked across that stage, my heart nearly burst. I cheered so loudly people turned around. He looked at me and smiled, and in that moment I saw all those nights on the floor, all those hours in the cold, all those prayers whispered into the void. They were worth it. I believed he would never forget what we'd been through together. I believed he would always carry me in his heart, the way I carried him through every fire. But life has a way of testing the very things we think are unshakable. As he went off to college, on a scholarship we'd fought tooth and nail for, I felt pride, yes, but also fear. Fear that he would outgrow me. That the world I'd kept him safe from would now tell him stories about who I was that didn't match the truth. I still sent care packages every month. Homemade cookies, his favorite socks, handwritten notes telling him how proud I was. Sometimes he replied. Sometimes he didn't. And I told myself it was okay. That he was busy. That he was becoming the man I'd raised him to be. I didn't realize until much later that while I had raised him to be strong and independent, I had also unintentionally taught him that I didn't need anything in return. That I was invincible. That love didn't require acknowledgement. And so he stopped seeing me. Not out of malice, but out of misunderstanding. I had loved him so completely, so silently, that he thought I didn't need to be seen, heard, or remembered. And I, too tired to explain, let the distance grow. But back then, in those years when I was raising him alone, I never imagined an ending where he wouldn't be beside me. I saw us sitting together decades later, laughing about the old apartment, sharing stories with his children, him holding my hand and thanking me for everything. I didn't know I was building a future that only existed in my own heart. Because in real life, sometimes love isn't enough to hold people together. Sometimes they forget. Sometimes they walk into rooms filled with light and celebration and forget the hands that built their staircase to the top. And sometimes, they seat you in a kitchen while they toast to family, not realizing that the very core of that word is sitting behind a wall, invisible and heartbroken. But that knowledge came later. In those days I still believed in the magic of motherhood. Still believed that my love was planting seeds in his soul that would bloom into gratitude, connection, and devotion. I didn't know that some seeds get buried so deep they never see the sun again. But oh, how I loved him. Fiercely. Completely. Without condition. I gave him everything. And in return all I wanted was to be remembered. They talk about motherhood like it's some kind of holy calling, glorious, natural, fulfilling, but they never talk about the loneliness, the quiet breakdowns behind locked bathroom doors, the way you disappear a little more each day until you're just a figure moving through routines, until your name isn't even yours anymore but becomes just mom or ma. And then sometimes not even that, just a silence when they walk past you with their headphones on or forget to answer your calls. I used to look in the mirror late at night after long shifts and hours spent helping with homework or scrubbing stains out of hand-me-down clothes. And I wouldn't recognize the woman staring back at me. There were lines in places I hadn't noticed before. My eyes had lost the light they used to have, and my body, once filled with dreams and music and mischief, now just a vessel for survival, for labor, for waiting. I aged in the shadows so slowly and so unnoticed that even I didn't realize how far I had drifted from myself until it was too late, until joy felt foreign and laughter came with guilt. How could I laugh when there was always something to do, something to pay, something to fear? I remember once when my son was around 9, he came home excited from school with a Mother's Day card he had made, glitter stuck to his fingers, and he read it out loud with a smile so wide it could have broken me. And I cried not just because of the card but because it was the first time in months I felt like someone saw me, like I wasn't just a machine or a background character in someone else's story. But moments like those were rare, and as he grew older, the cards stopped, the hugs became brief, and the distance between us turned from physical to emotional, a canyon I couldn't cross no matter how many dinners I cooked or how often I offered to drive him places. I never asked for anything back, and maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I should have taught him that love needs to be fed too, that caretakers need care, that even warriors need rest, but I didn't because I thought being strong meant being silent, and now I realize that silence is the fastest way to become invisible. There were nights I'd sit at the kitchen table long after he went to bed, pretending to balance the budget when really I was just trying to feel something, anything, that reminded me I was more than the bills, more than the endless tasks, more than the woman people only called when they needed something. I missed having a name, a dream, a voice. I missed being touched with tenderness, being asked how I was and actually listened to when I answered. I gave up everything slowly, bit by bit. First it was sleep, then friends, then hobbies, then my health, and finally my sense of self. I stopped buying new clothes, stopped going to the doctor unless it was an emergency, stopped reading books that weren't related to parenting or saving money, and each of those decisions felt small in the moment, like manageable compromises, but stacked together they became a monument to my disappearance. I used to love dancing. I'd put on music and twirl around the room, laughing, free, full of life. But at some point the music stopped and I didn't even notice. I told myself it was just a phase, just a season of life, that one day when things got better I'd return to myself. But things never really got better, they just got busier, heavier, lonelier. I pretended I didn't care when people overlooked me, when they interrupted me, when they took my presence for granted, but it chipped away at something deep inside. Because when you're always the one holding the world together, no one ever stops to ask what happens if you break. I remember one day at the grocery store I stood in line behind a woman laughing on the phone with someone who called her babe, and I felt this sharp ache. Not jealousy, but grief, for the version of myself who once had that, who once mattered to someone in a way that felt romantic, sacred, seen. I hadn't been touched gently in years, hadn't been kissed or held or even looked at with softness, and I realized then that I had become a ghost in my own life. Not dead, but fading, unnoticed, unneeded except for function. The worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion, it was the emotional starvation, giving love constantly, endlessly, without ever being filled back up. And as my son grew into a man, that hunger only deepened. Because I thought maybe once he saw the full picture, once he understood everything I'd done, he'd turn back and reach for me, say thank you not just with words but with time, with care, with presence. But he didn't. He got busier, wrapped up in his own world, and I didn't blame him, not really, but the ache was still there, a quiet throb in my chest every time he forgot to call, every time he said later, and later never came. People say motherhood is thankless, but they don't tell you how that thanklessness accumulates, how it hardens into resentment that you try so hard to push down because you don't want to be bitter, you don't want to ruin the love with your sadness, but it's there lurking under every quiet sigh, every forced smile, every "it's okay" when it really isn't. I used to think I was strong because I never asked for anything, but now I see that strength is also asking, also claiming space, also saying, I matter too, and I never did that, never fought for myself, never demanded the love I gave so freely. I made him my whole world, and in doing so I forgot to hold on to myself. And by the time I realized that, there was so little of me left to save. And still I kept going. I kept waking up before sunrise to make breakfast, kept sewing buttons on his shirts, kept packing his favorite snacks, kept remembering his friends' names and asking how their exams went, even when he barely grunted in response. Because love for me wasn't a feeling, it was a decision. Daily choice, a sacred duty. And even now, even as I look back and feel the weight of all those silent sacrifices, I wouldn't take them back. But I do wish someone just once had looked me in the eye and said, I see you. You matter. You're not just a mother. You're a human being with a soul that deserves to be held. It started slowly, like most heartbreaks do, not with a slam of a door or a shouted goodbye, but with missed calls, shortened visits, and a tone in his voice that carried something I couldn't quite name at first. A kind of polite impatience that stung worse than anger ever could. I used to think our bond was unshakable, forged in the fires of every hardship we had faced together, but I began to realize that while I had built my life around him, he had been building a life away from me, and it didn't hit all at once, but in pieces, like the way he stopped asking for my opinion on things, or how he'd cancel our Sunday dinners with a text that said, something came up, and I'd try to smile through it, try to be understanding, because that's what mothers do, right? We adjust, we make excuses for the ones we love, we convince ourselves that it's just a phase, just stress, just adulthood doing its inevitable damage. But deep down I felt it. That slow unspooling of connection, the quiet removal of me from the center of his world. And it terrified me in a way I couldn't even explain to myself because I had nothing else, no one else, just him. And then came her, Emily, his girlfriend, then fiancée, and eventually the woman who would stand beside him at the altar while I stood behind a kitchen wall. The first time he introduced us, I wanted to like her, I really did, because he looked at her with such soft eyes, the kind I hadn't seen in him since he was a little boy showing me his drawings, and I thought, if she makes him happy I will learn to love her. But it's hard to love someone who sees you as a threat, even when you're trying so hard to stay small, to stay kind, to stay out of the way. She was polite, always polite, but cold in a way that felt rehearsed. She'd smile at me but never ask questions, never linger in conversation, never include me in plans unless my son reminded her. I noticed the way she'd stiffen when I touched his arm, or the way he'd quickly change the subject when I mentioned our past, our shared history, as if it embarrassed him now, as if our struggles were too loud, too raw for the life he was trying to curate. And I can't blame her entirely. She didn't know the nights I stayed awake worrying about his asthma attacks, the mornings I walked 5 miles in the snow to make it to his parent-teacher conferences, the years I spent tucking my own needs into the smallest drawer so he could have a chance at something better. But what hurt was how he let her push those memories aside, how he started rewriting his own narrative with her as the beginning, as if I had just been a prelude to his real life. I remember one dinner when I mentioned a story from his childhood and she laughed, politely, dismissively, and said, "Wow, he never told me that." And he shrugged like it wasn't important, like it was just a story, and I wanted to scream. It was everything. It was your life, our life, and I held it all together with my bare hands. But I stayed quiet, smiled, and changed the subject because I didn't want to be that mother, the clingy one, the overbearing one, the one who couldn't let go. But letting go of someone you built your entire world around isn't noble. It's excruciating. I started noticing how our conversations grew shorter, how his eyes wandered when I spoke, how he would look at his phone mid-sentence, and I told myself, he's busy, he's stressed. But I knew the truth. He was pulling away, and I was still clinging to the memory of a boy who used to cry when I left the room, who used to write me notes that said, "You're the best mom in the world." I still have those notes tucked in a box under my bed, stained with age and hope, and sometimes I'd take them out just to remind myself that I wasn't imagining the love we once had. Emily started planning the wedding, and I was hardly involved. Decisions were made without me, updates were relayed like afterthoughts, and when I tried to offer help, it was met with that tight smile of hers and a gentle, "We've got it covered." The invitations went out, and mine arrived late, addressed not with warmth but formality, as if I were a distant relative rather than the woman who raised the groom. I called him, asked if I could be part of the planning, maybe help with decorations or seating, and he paused, long enough for the ache to rise in my throat before saying, "Emily's handling most of it, Ma, but don't worry, you'll have a seat at the front." And I held on to those words like a promise, not knowing they would unravel into the deepest betrayal I'd ever feel. I tried to be happy for him, truly. I bought a new dress, saved 4 weeks to afford it, even got my hair done for the first time in years. All because I wanted to look like someone who mattered, like someone worthy of standing beside her son on the most important day of his life. But in the days leading up to the wedding I felt it. His growing distance, the way he spoke more to her than to me, the way his calls became mechanical, filled with logistics instead of love, and I told myself, he's overwhelmed, it's just the wedding stress. But deep down I knew something was shifting, something irreversible. And still I showed up with hope in my chest, with pride in my step, with the belief that maybe, just maybe, he would look at me and remember everything, that he would pull me in for a hug, whisper, "Thank you," and seat me proudly beside him. But even as I rehearsed that fantasy in my mind, I felt the growing ache of reality pressing in, whispering, "You're not the main character anymore. You're a footnote, a faded photograph in the album he rarely opens." And it hurt. Not in a sharp, sudden way, but in a slow, corrosive way, like rust eating through metal, like time erasing footprints in the sand. And I kept wondering, when did I stop being his home? When did I become just another guest? I told myself I was being too sensitive, too emotional, too selfish even. But love isn't selfish when it's built on sacrifice, when it's given so completely for so many years that it becomes the very air you breathe. I loved him too much to resent him. But I was starting to resent the silence, the fading, the way I had to fight to stay in a life I had once been the center of. And the most heartbreaking part wasn't that he chose someone else. It was that he never looked back to see if I was still following, still waiting, still hoping for even the smallest recognition of everything I had poured into him. And so, I kept smiling through the ache, nodding through the disappointment, clapping at rehearsals I wasn't invited to, all while feeling like I was slowly being erased from my own son's story. The invitation arrived late, weeks after others had already received theirs, tucked inside a plain envelope that bore no warmth, no personal note, no flourish of inclusion. It simply read, "You are invited," followed by the names of my son and the woman who, I had slowly come to realize, was rewriting his life in a way that didn't include me. Still, I held it in my hands like it was gold, smoothing the paper again and again as if it might transform into something warmer, more intimate, more reflective of the bond one believed still tethered us together despite everything, and I let myself believe, truly believe, that maybe the awkward distance, the shortened conversations, the hollow "love you ma" at the end of hurried phone calls were all just symptoms of stress, of a young man overwhelmed by planning, by transition, by life pulling him in too many directions at once. I told myself that weddings are chaotic and that when the dust settled he'd turn back to me, anchored to the woman who had been his foundation, his first home, the reason he had ever even dreamed this big. I spent weeks preparing, pouring myself into the smallest details like it might matter. Choosing a dress that didn't look too plain or too proud, practicing my smile in the mirror to hide the weariness etched across my face, fixing my hair in a style I hadn't worn since before he was born because it made me feel like maybe I still had a trace of the woman I used to be before the years of sacrifice buried her under fatigue and necessity. I bought a pair of shoes I couldn't really afford, pinched pennies on groceries so I could have them, because I wanted to walk into that ceremony with dignity, not as the woman who raised him in hardship, but as someone honored, seen, cherished. I imagined the moment I'd see him in his suit, tall and handsome and beaming with that smile he used to reserve just for me when he won a school prize or showed me a drawing he was proud of, and I dreamed, because hope is cruel like that, of him taking my hand and whispering, "Thank you, Ma," in the quiet way he used to when words didn't come easy. I arrived early, holding tightly to the small card that bore my name, expecting a usher or a coordinator to greet me, to show me to my seat, perhaps even near the front where parents of the groom are meant to be. But instead, a young man with a headset and clipboard glanced at my card, furrowed his brow and asked me to wait just a moment, his voice brisk and indifferent, as he disappeared into the chaos behind the scenes. I stood there awkwardly, smiling at guests I didn't know, watching them flow past me with laughter and excitement, their arms linked, their smiles wide, until he returned and, with a flicker of confusion, or maybe discomfort, asked me to follow him through a side corridor, past the decorated hall, past the laughter and champagne and into the kitchen. The kitchen with its humming refrigerators, its scent of food not yet served, its clatter of plates and shouted orders. I stopped, not understanding, thinking maybe this was a mistake, that he was showing me a shortcut or a back entrance to something more. But then he gestured to a plain chair by a counter beside the catering crew and said, "You can wait here," and my heart stopped. Not the kind of dramatic heartbreak that makes you cry out, but the kind that freezes every part of you, the kind that hollows your bones. "There's been a mix-up with the seating," he added quickly, not meeting my eyes, already half-turned to leave, and I opened my mouth to protest, to say that surely there had been a mistake, but something in his tone, in the way he wouldn't look at me, told me this wasn't a clerical error. It was a choice. I sat down slowly, my dress creasing awkwardly beneath me, the heels I had bled for pinching my feet, and tried to breathe, to stay composed, to not cry because I had promised myself I wouldn't cry, not today, not here, not like this. The kitchen door swung open and shut as staff moved in and out, barely glancing at me, and the sound of the ceremony starting drifted through the cracks. Music, applause, the muffled voice of an officiant. I reached for my phone, pulled up the livestream link he had sent me days before, not realizing at the time what that implied. That they hadn't planned for me to be present, only to observe. And there he was, my son, standing at the altar with his bride, radiant and glowing, while I sat alone among trays of unserved appetizers and buckets of ice. I watched him say vows, watched him slip a ring on her finger, watched as they kissed to a room full of cheers, and I felt myself splitting inside, not out of jealousy, not even out of hurt pride, but out of a grief so profound it felt like mourning a death, not of a person, but of a bond one thought could never be broken. And then, just as I was about to turn off the screen, numb and trembling, I heard it. Her voice, Emily's voice, behind the kitchen door, low and sharp. "I told you this would be simpler," she said. "Your mom wouldn't fit in with the rest of the guests, and I didn't want her making a scene." And then his voice quieter but unmistakably his. I know, I just, She looked so excited this morning I didn't know it would feel this bad. And then Emily again with a finality that chilled me. She'll be fine. He always is. She knows her place. And they walked away laughing softly as the door swung shut, leaving me frozen, phone in hand, breath caught in my throat, the twist of the knife not from strangers or circumstance, but from the one soul I had built my life around. They had planned this, consciously, deliberately, and my son, my own flesh and blood, had let it happen, had chosen to silence me, to tuck me out of sight like something shameful, inconvenient, unpresentable. And suddenly the years, the decades of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the aching body, the missed opportunities, all of it collapsed on me at once, a weight I couldn't carry anymore. Not because it was new, but because now I understood it had never been seen, never been valued, never been sacred to him the way it had been sacred to me. I sat in that kitchen until the ceremony ended, until the guests moved to the reception hall, until I could hear the music swell and the toasts begin, and I waited, not for someone to come find me, but for the last of the hope to drain from my chest. And when it did, I stood, smoothed my dress and walked out, not into the hall, not into confrontation, not into anything, but out the back door into the cool night, past the dumpsters and the caterers smoking cigarettes, past the venue lights and the life I had been quietly written out of, and I kept walking, heels clicking on pavement, each step echoing with the finality of a goodbye I hadn't known I needed until now. And for the first time in my life I didn't look back, I didn't move, not right away, not for a long time, because when the weight of a lifetime crashes down on you all at once, your body doesn't scream or flail, it just stops. I sat there in that ugly plastic chair, still holding the now cold cup of tea that someone had handed me hours earlier out of formality, not kindness, and stared blankly at the linoleum floor, not really seeing it, just using it as something to focus on so the tears wouldn't come, because if they started, I wasn't sure they'd ever stop. Around me the kitchen buzzed with life, orders being shouted, pans clanging, steam rising from hot trays, but it all felt distant, like I was watching a movie of someone else's life. A life I didn't belong to anymore, if I ever really had. I kept hearing her voice in my head, echoing like a cruel refrain. She'll be fine. He always is. She knows her place. And it gutted me, not just because it was cruel, but because it was true. Or at least, it had been true for so long that I had let them believe it was a fact. I had trained them to think I didn't need to be seen, that I didn't need a seat at the table, that I would always stay in the background, quietly supporting, endlessly giving, never demanding, never disrupting the pretty image they wanted to present to the world. And my son, God, my son, he didn't even argue, didn't push back, didn't defend me or say, no, she deserves to be up front, to be honored, to be seated beside me. No, he just agreed, hesitated for a breath maybe, but then agreed, and that small sound in his voice, that weak little, I didn't know it would feel this bad, wasn't remorse, it was guilt, guilt that would pass, guilt that wouldn't change anything because he'd already chosen, already decided where I belonged. And it wasn't by his side. I stared at the door that separated me from the celebration, and for a moment I imagined bursting through it, making a scene, confronting them all with the truth. But I knew I wouldn't do that, because dignity is the last thing you cling to when everything else has been stripped away. So I sat and I let the memories come. Not the sweet ones, not the ones I'd been trying to protect with hope and sentimentality, but the raw ones, the brutal ones, the ones I had buried deep to keep myself going. The time I sold my coat in winter so he could go on a field trip and told him I liked staying home anyway. The night I went without medicine because his asthma prescription wiped out my paycheck. The birthdays I spent alone, waiting by the phone, pretending it was okay that he forgot. The jobs I took cleaning houses where people spoke to me like I was invisible just so I could buy him books he barely read. Each one of those sacrifices surged to the surface now, not as triumphs but as questions that screamed, what was it for? What did it buy me? Where did it get me? And the answers were all around me, in the cheap plastic chair, in the smell of stale food, in the sound of celebration I wasn't part of. I had been everything for him, and now I was nothing less than nothing, because at least nothing is neutral. I was something inconvenient, something to be hidden, a reminder of struggle in a life that now wanted to pretend it had always been polished, easy, elegant. I kept thinking about how proud I had been to raise him alone, how I used to walk with him through the city, holding his tiny hand, pointing at trees and clouds and making up stories to distract him from the growl in our stomachs. How I used to believe that love, real, deep, selfless love, would plant roots that couldn't be pulled up by anything. But I was wrong. Love, unreciprocated, unacknowledged, becomes something else. It becomes a burden, a ghost, a wound that never closes, and I was bleeding now, silently behind a kitchen door while the people I loved most toasted to a future I had no place in. One of the waiters accidentally brushed past me, muttering an apology without really looking at me, and it hit me how symbolic that was. Everyone was always brushing past me, apologizing without meaning it, and I kept stepping aside, making room, disappearing so others could be comfortable. I had done it in my marriage, shrinking to accommodate a man who never stayed, and I had done it in motherhood, giving so completely that I forgot how to keep any part of myself for myself, and now here I was, not even sure who I was anymore, just a shell in a dress that no one would remember, seated next to the garbage bins while my son danced with his bride. And maybe the most devastating part wasn't that I was here. It was that no one even thought to check on me, to wonder where I had gone, to ask, "Where's the groom's mother?" Because they all assumed that I was fine, that I would stay quiet, that I would accept whatever scraps were handed to me, and for so long I felt something shift inside me then, something final, something terrifying, a click like a door locking from the inside, and I knew I couldn't go back, not to the way things were, not to the endless waiting and hoping and giving. Something had broken that couldn't be repaired, and it wasn't anger that filled me, not even sadness anymore, but this cold, vast emptiness, like a winter that would never thaw, and I realized that I was done, not with love, not with motherhood, but with begging to be seen, with showing up where I wasn't wanted, with building homes in people's hearts who only wanted to rent me for the hard times. The music swelled louder, someone's voice shouting, "To the happy couple," and a chorus of clinking glasses followed, and I stood, my knees stiff, my body heavier than it had ever felt, and I looked around one last time, not to memorize but to let go. This kitchen, this night, this betrayal, they would mark the end of something I had clung to for too long, the illusion that love was enough, that sacrifice guaranteed remembrance, that being a mother meant being honored. I slipped out quietly, unnoticed, and for the first time I didn't hope that anyone would come looking. Not because I didn't want to be found, but because I finally understood that the people inside that hall had already decided I was gone long ago. The days after I disappeared didn't feel like freedom at first. They felt like disorientation, like waking up in someone else's life, a life without schedules, without reminders, without anyone asking for anything. And that silence, which I had longed for in the chaos of motherhood, now echoed so loudly it felt almost unbearable, like a mirror I had to face without distraction. I rented a tiny room in a town no one had heard of, a place where the streets were lined with trees and people didn't ask questions beyond the polite, "Are you new here?" And even that stopped after a week or two when they realized I wasn't interested in telling stories. I took long walks in the morning, wrapped in sweaters that smelled like the boxes I had packed, and watched the fog lift off the hills like secrets being slowly forgotten. And somewhere in that quiet I began to breathe. Not deeply, not fully, but in a way I hadn't in years, without tension in my chest, without fear of being needed the moment I sat down. I got a job at a small second-hand bookstore run by an older woman named May, who never pried, just smiled and said, "Sometimes books find people when they need to hide." And I nodded, grateful for her silence, her space, her shared understanding that not everyone who disappears wants to be found. The bookstore became my sanctuary, dusty shelves, creaking floorboards, the smell of paper and time. It felt like standing in a chapel of forgotten voices, and for the first time in years I wasn't just surviving, I was pausing, I was existing. I learned how to cook for one without apology, without feeling the weight of another person's hunger guiding my hands, and I sat at a small table by the window with meals that didn't need to be shared to be sacred. I bought myself fresh flowers from the market every Saturday, just one stem, sometimes two, and placed them in a chipped vase I found on a sale shelf, watching them bloom and fade without sadness, because even short-lived beauty deserves to be witnessed. I started writing again. Not letters, not journals, but small scraps of thought, fragments of memory, not to send, not to share, just to hold on to the parts of me that had nearly been erased. I wrote about the smell of my son's hair when he was a baby, about the first time he called me mama, about the sound of his laugh when I pretended to be a dragon chasing him around the apartment. And even though those memories still stung, I let them live, because pretending they hadn't mattered would have been the worst betrayal of all. I missed him with an ache so deep it settled in my bones. But I didn't regret leaving, because loving someone doesn't mean destroying yourself for their comfort, and I had spent far too many years calling that destruction devotion. I received no calls, no letters, no emails, and I stopped checking after a while, stopped hoping for that message that would say, "I'm sorry, I see you now, come home," because I realized I didn't want to return to the version of life where my value was conditional, invisible, expendable. I visited the ocean once, just sat on a bench and listened to the waves like a lullaby meant only for me, and I cried, not from grief, but from the overwhelming realization that the world still held beauty even when no one was watching, even when I wasn't being anyone's mother, anyone's backbone, anyone's ghost. I started noticing small things again. The way sunlight filtered through lace curtains in the afternoon, the way the smell of fresh bread made me close my eyes, the way silence could be soft instead of sharp, a blanket instead of a blade, and in that noticing I began to remember who I was before I became everything for someone else. I remembered that I used to sing, used to dance barefoot in the kitchen, used to dream of seeing the northern lights, and while some of those things still felt far away, they no longer felt impossible. I began to forgive, not him, not fully, but myself, for staying too long in a place where I was no longer seen, for shrinking so someone else could shine, for loving so blindly that I forgot to ask for love in return. And that forgiveness was quiet, private, not a grand declaration but a slow exhale, a loosening of the grip I had on the past, on the pain, on the need to be anything more than just okay. May sometimes left books on the counter for me to take home. Poetry mostly, or novels about women who ran away and found themselves in strange places. And I devoured them like medicine, like prayers whispered on paper, and each one reminded me that I wasn't alone in my disappearing, that there were other women like me scattered across the world, living lives they never thought they'd have because the ones they gave everything to forgot to look back. And still I didn't hate him. How could I? He was my greatest love, my most sacred offering. But I no longer lived in the shadow of that love, no longer bent myself into silence just to keep his world comfortable. I was learning, slowly, painfully, to be enough for myself, to be whole in my solitude, to be more than the sum of what I had given away. And maybe that's what rebirth really is. Not fireworks, not declarations, but the steady decision to keep waking up, to keep choosing peace over punishment, to keep placing flowers in the chipped vase even when no one will see them bloom. I had ended it all that night at the wedding, not with tragedy, not with fire, but with the quietest revolution. A woman walking away not to be found, but to finally find herself. It took days for anyone to notice I was gone. Not hours, not that night, not even the next morning, but days. And maybe that's the part that hurt him most in the end, that when he finally reached for me, I had already gone so far he couldn't find my voice in the places he once ignored it. At first it was probably just a passing thought in his mind, the kind you brush off with, I should call Mom, followed by a distracted scroll through his phone or a half-hearted plan to check in later, and later was always enough for him, always sufficient because I had never not been there, never not answered, never not said, "Of course, sweetheart, I understand." I imagine it started with a missed call. His, not mine. Maybe after Emily mentioned something small like a leftover wedding detail they'd forgotten to thank me for. Or perhaps because someone at the reception asked why I hadn't been in any of the family photos, and he gave a vague answer, brushing it off because brushing me off had become second nature, a habit formed through years of watching me shrink and learning to let it happen. When he finally dialed, I didn't answer, and not because I was trying to punish him, but because I was done explaining myself to people who didn't hear me the first time. I didn't check the messages, didn't listen to the voicemails, but I know the tone must have shifted. From casual to concerned, from, "Hey ma, just checking in," to, "Where are you? Are you okay?" And somewhere between those two tones, panic must have crept in, the kind that clutches your throat when you realize you took something for granted and it might never be yours again. I imagine him pacing the apartment, phone in hand, calling again and again, then finally going to mine, using the spare key I had given him years ago with a soft, "in case of emergency," the key I now wish I had taken back, not because of spite but because of finality, because he had used that key to enter my space only after it had stopped being mine. When he opened the door, everything would have been in order. Nothing dramatic, no chaos, just absence, just quiet, like a body that had been laid to rest with care. My room would have been empty, drawers clean, the kitchen bare but tidy, the smell of lavender still lingering from the candle I lit one last time before I walked away. He would have found the note then, folded neatly on the dining table, not dramatic, not accusatory, just the truth. "I loved you every day of your life. That won't change. But I have to go now." I didn't sign it, not because I didn't want him to know it was from me, but because I wanted the words to live beyond the signature, beyond the roles we'd both failed in. I imagine he read it more than once, standing in that tiny living room, the same one where we used to eat takeout on the floor and laugh at sitcom reruns. And the weight of those words must have hit slowly at first, like fog settling before a storm. Maybe he called Emily then, voice tight with a panic he couldn't name, asking if She knew where I'd gone and maybe she said, "She'll be back," in that clipped tone of hers that always dismissed anything she couldn't control. But as the days turned into weeks and there were no signs, no transactions on my bank account, no posts, no notes left at neighbors' doors, I know the panic would have grown into something heavier, something that kept him up at night, staring at the ceiling, retracing his steps, asking himself when exactly I began to fade. Because the truth is I had been disappearing for years right in front of him and he hadn't noticed until I was gone for good. Maybe he went back to the wedding photos, scrolling through the ones he once thought were perfect, only now seeing the gap, the absence, the fact that his own mother wasn't there. Not by accident but by choice, by exclusion, by design. Maybe he listened to the recording of the vows, looking for the moment he should have noticed the quiet, should have asked someone where I was, should have said my name aloud, and maybe, just maybe, he replayed that moment in the kitchen hallway, the one I know he thought I never heard, where Emily said, "She knows her place," and he didn't speak up, didn't say anything at all, just let the door close behind him as if I were a problem solved, not a woman erased. Guilt is a strange creature. It doesn't come all at once, it creeps in at night. It echoes through the empty spaces of a house once filled with certainty, and I hope in a way that it did echo not to hurt him but to teach him, to show him the cost of neglect isn't always loud, sometimes it's just silence that never ends. Maybe he went to the neighbors, asked if they'd seen me, maybe he called my old job, the bookstore May now runs alone, and maybe May told him what little she knew, that I had been kind, quiet, always tired, and that one day I just didn't come back. I hope she didn't tell him more than that. Not because I want to remain a mystery, but because this new version of me isn't his to own, isn't his to fix. I became someone else, someone I had long buried beneath duty and devotion, and in leaving, I chose that woman for the first time in my life. And yet I know he must have cried, must have sat in my empty apartment and wept not just for me, but for himself, for the boy who once clung to my leg on his first day of school, for the young man who forgot the sound of my laugh, for the husband who married into a new life without making room for the one who built the foundation. And perhaps that's what stung him most, not that I left, but that he hadn't even noticed I was going, hadn't seen the signs, hadn't asked the questions that could have changed everything. Grief, when tangled with guilt, is a brutal companion, and I know he carries it now. Not because I wanted revenge but because I needed space to finally breathe, to exist without begging to be seen. And in his silence now I hope he listens, not just to what was lost, but to what was never truly held in the first place, that he didn't realize how loud silence could be until mine swallowed him whole. Until the quiet phone line, the unopened messages, the untouched photo frames on my old apartment walls became a chorus of questions he couldn't answer. And every day that passed without a response from me felt like a new layer of weight pressing down on his chest. He started replaying everything. Every conversation where I sounded tired and he didn't ask why. Every moment I stepped aside so he could shine and he didn't reach back for my hand. Every missed birthday. Every unanswered text that said, "It's okay, I understand." Because now he knew that what I understood was that he had stopped seeing me long before he left me in that kitchen. And that knowledge became a kind of poison, slow and irreversible, spreading through his memories until even the happiest ones turned bitter. He started hearing my voice in places it didn't belong. In the grocery store aisle when he passed the brand of tea I used to drink. In the wind outside his apartment window late at night. In the quiet hum of the morning when he used to wake up to the smell of my cooking on weekends he no longer remembered attending. Emily noticed the change, of course she did. But instead of asking what he needed, she tightened around him like a vice, suggesting he stop dwelling, that he move forward. And when he looked at her now, all he could see was the moment she said I'd be fine in the kitchen, the moment she convinced him to hide me like a blemish on their perfect day, and her voice, once soft and persuasive, now grated against the guilt pulsing in his ears. He tried to write to me, 3 times for maybe more. But every time the words turned to ash on the page, because what do you say to the person who gave you everything when you finally realized you gave nothing back? What apology could span decades of neglect, of love returned with forgetfulness, of sacrifices met with silence? He tried to ask May where I had gone, but May, fiercely loyal and fiercely quiet, simply said, "She's at peace," and turned back to stacking books, and that response shook him more than any direct refusal, because it meant I didn't want to be found, didn't need him anymore, not in the way he suddenly, desperately needed me. He went back through every photo album, every school project, every old birthday card I had saved in a box he never knew existed until he opened the closet and found it. Labeled in my handwriting, his life. And the sight of that label alone undid him. Inside were years of memories he'd never asked about, drawings from kindergarten, report cards, newspaper clippings, even a crumpled bus ticket from the day he had his first interview out of college. A day he didn't even remember telling me about, but I had celebrated alone with a cup of instant coffee and a whispered prayer that life would be kinder to him than it was to me. And now, sitting on the floor of an apartment that still smelled faintly like lavender and starch, surrounded by a life that had been lived for him, not with him, he finally began to understand, not the way people understand something factual, but the way the body understands pain, in the bones, in the breath, in the places words can't reach. He remembered the time I offered to help with wedding decorations and how he'd brushed it off, saying Emily had it under control, and how I'd smiled and nodded, pretending I wasn't hurt, and he realized he'd mistaken that smile for peace when it was resignation, mistaken my silence for comfort when it was despair. And worst of all, he remembered walking past that kitchen door, remembered seeing my silhouette through the small window, hunched and still, holding a cup of tea like it was the last thing tethering me to the moment, and he had told himself it was fine, that I understood, that it was just for the evening, but now he knew that moment had broken something final and he had walked away. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice, and that's what haunted him most. Not that things had happened, but that he let them, that he stood by and watched the person who had given him everything be set aside like an afterthought. He tried to bring it up to Emily once, to talk about it, to say, we were wrong. But she dismissed it, called it emotional guilt, and said, she'll come around. And that was the moment he knew she didn't understand. Not who I was, not what I had meant. Not what had been lost. The space between them widened after that. Not through fights, not through shouting, but through silence, the kind that grows when two people are pretending things are fine when they're not. He stopped sleeping, stopped laughing, stopped feeling at home in his own skin, because every corner of his life now echoed with absence. Mine. And it wasn't just that I was gone, it was that I had taken with me something sacred, something he didn't realize he needed until it was no longer there. The unwavering presence of someone who had loved him without condition, without agenda, without asking for anything in return except to be remembered. He started walking the streets at night, passing strangers and wondering if I had once walked the same path, wondered if the woman on the park bench or the one feeding birds at dawn might be me, just older, freer, quieter. He hoped for a glimpse, a sign, but there was nothing, and the more he searched, the more he realized I had done what he never imagined possible. I had let go. And now he was left holding the pieces of a life built on borrowed love, love he had mistaken for permanence, for obligation, never realizing that even the strongest love has limits when left unwatered, unspoken, unseen. And in the stillness of his guilt, he finally whispered the words that had come too late. I'm sorry, Ma. And no one answered. That it started not with a grand plan or a moment of clarity, but with restlessness, the kind that claws at your insides and makes it impossible to sit still, to sleep, to pretend anymore. And one evening, long after Emily had stopped asking where his mind was, long after the wedding photos had been stored away in a drawer he could no longer bear to open, he packed a small bag and walked out the door without knowing where he was going, only that he had to try, had to find her, had to look her in the eyes and say what had burned inside him since the night he opened that letter. I'm sorry. I see you now. He had no address, no forwarding contact, just vague recollections of the people who had briefly intersected her life in the years before the wedding, so he started where he thought she might have left the deepest trace. The bookstore she worked in, the one she never talked about with pride, but always returned to with a strange sense of calm. May was there when he arrived, older than he remembered, her gray hair twisted into a loose knot, glasses perched low on her nose as she stacked books with the kind of tenderness usually reserved for cradling something fragile and sacred. When he introduced himself, she didn't blink, didn't ask him to repeat it, just looked at him long and hard as if weighing the worth of what he was about to say. I'm her son, he whispered, his voice catching, and she nodded once, slowly, then turned away and walked to a drawer behind the counter, pulling out a small tin box and handing it to him without a word. Inside were a few things: an old library card with his mother's name, a folded paper with a poem scribbled in her handwriting, and a list of dates and towns, all within a day's travel from each other. She didn't say much, May finally said, her voice soft but unwavering, but she was healing here. And then one day she left like she arrived, quietly, completely. He thanked her, holding the box like a fragile heartbeat, and began to follow the trail, not in desperation now, but in reverence, as though each town was a shrine to the woman he had failed to see. each stop a step deeper into a version of her life he had never bothered to learn before. In the first town he met a florist who remembered a woman who always bought single stems, always said, "Just one, please, it's enough," and who once sat in the shop for an hour on a rainy afternoon not talking, just smelling the lilies like they held the key to a memory she couldn't name. In another town, a cafe owner pointed him to a back corner table. She sat there. Every Thursday, always alone, always with a book, always paid in cash, and when he sat there himself tried to feel what she might have felt, all he found was the weight of her silence, her chosen solitude, and it nearly crushed him. In a coastal village, a widowed painter showed him a sketch she had left behind. An ocean at dusk with a single figure walking away from the shoreline, faceless, quiet, peaceful. And on the back she had written, "It's not the leaving that hurts, it's that I had to go. To be whole." He stared at that sketch for a long time, tracing the figure with his eyes, and realized that for the first time in his life, his mother had chosen herself, not in defiance but in preservation, and it was the most painful and beautiful truth he had ever seen. He began keeping a notebook, jotting down everything he learned, not because he thought he could compile enough data to find her, but because each detail felt like a thread connecting him back to her, a map not to her location but to her heart. And in those stories he heard echoes of the woman he had forgotten. How she laughed softly when she thought no one was listening, how she always tipped exactly 20% no matter how broke she was, how she hummed under her breath when folding laundry, and how she never, ever, talked about herself unless someone asked, and almost no one ever had. He stayed in motels and small inns, each night replaying his childhood in flashes, how she used to press a kiss to his forehead before school, how she kept every drawing he ever made even when they were just scribbles, how she always smelled like cinnamon and soap, how her hands were always moving, always working, always tired but never still. He remembered her sitting alone at school plays, clapping harder than anyone else, how she cheered louder than all the other parents at his graduation even when he barely waved in her direction, how she sent care packages in college he rarely opened, and how she always said, "I'm just glad you're happy," even when he hadn't asked her if she was. And he wept, not once but often, sometimes in gas station bathrooms, sometimes on park benches, sometimes in the car pulled over on the side of an empty road, because the grief of losing someone while they're still alive, because of your own blindness, is a grief that leaves no clean edges. And as he moved from place to place, piecing together this mosaic of her second life, he began to understand that what he had done wasn't a single act of forgetting but a lifetime of overlooking, a slow erosion of presence disguised as independence, a dismissal of her humanity wrapped in the language of growing up. And still he hoped, not with the arrogance of a man who believed he deserved her forgiveness, but with the trembling hope of a son who finally saw the shape of the mother he had lost and just wanted to tell her that she mattered, that she always mattered, that he remembered now, and that it wasn't too late to say it even if it was too late to be the son he should have been. He carried the box May gave him everywhere, sleeping with it beside him like a talisman, rereading the poem she had scribbled, "You don't have to be seen to be whole, but oh how the unseen long for sunlight," until the words lived in his veins. And with every town, with every stranger's story, he moved closer, not necessarily to her location, but to a truth he had never made space for. That love, once neglected, doesn't disappear, it simply learns to survive without you. That he found her on a Wednesday, fitting somehow because it was an ordinary day, the kind of day that doesn't hint at transformation, doesn't whisper that something long awaited will finally arrive. And he almost didn't recognize her at first, not because she looked so different, though she did in some subtle, unnameable way, but because she was still grounded, no longer the weary, waiting figure bent under the weight of a lifetime of giving. She sat outside a modest cottage on the edge of a quiet town, sipping tea from a chipped ceramic mug, her hair longer than he remembered, streaked with silver but shining in the late afternoon sun like strands of truth she no longer needed to hide. And there was a calm around her that made his heart ache, the calm of a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. He hesitated at the gate, unsure if he should go further, unsure if he had the right to cross the threshold of the life she had built without him, and she looked up slowly, her eyes meeting his without surprise, as if she had been expecting him not today but eventually, in the way the tide returns to the shore whether invited or not. For a long moment they just stared at each other, silence stretching between them like a bridge made of everything they hadn't said. He thought about how he used to run to her as a child, arms open, sure she would catch him, and now he stood frozen, uncertain if he even deserved to be seen, let alone embraced. She didn't speak first, didn't rise, didn't rush to fill the space with comfort or forgiveness, and that stillness was louder than any greeting could have been. It said, "I am not who you remember, and you are not who I left." He stepped closer, hands trembling, eyes wet, the words forming and crumbling all at once. "I didn't know. I'm sorry. I came too late." But she raised a hand gently, not to silence him with resentment, but to hold the moment in its truth, to let it breathe before it shattered. "You were never too late," she said softly, her voice steadier than he remembered. "You just never looked early enough." And that sentence broke him, cracked open the guilt he had carried like armor, and he sank to his knees in front of her like a boy again, not to beg, not to demand, but to finally be still in her presence, to let himself feel what he had ignored for too long. She reached forward and touched his cheek, not with the desperation of a mother reclaiming a lost child, but with the compassion of a woman who had found her peace and was willing just once to share it. "I needed to leave," she said, and he nodded because now he understood, not the surface version of that sentence, but the deep truth of it, the kind that lives in the marrow of silence. She had left to save herself, not from him, but from the erasure she had accepted too long. They sat together for a while, not speaking much, watching the wind stir the trees and the sky shift from blue to amber. And for the first time he didn't rush the moment, didn't try to fill the silence. He just listened, really listened, to the quiet between them, to the breath she took as she spoke of the places she had been, the things she had seen, the joy of not being needed, the strange sweetness of being a woman first and a mother second. He asked questions now, not out of guilt but out of awe, and with each answer he realized how much life she had missed while trying to keep his intact. She told him about the mornings spent walking by the river, about the poetry she'd begun writing again, about the meals she cooked just for herself without wondering if someone else would like it, and there was a glow in her voice that he didn't recognize, because he had never given her the space to have it before. He asked her to come back with him, not out of duty, but from a place that wanted to rebuild, to begin again, and she smiled gently, the kind of smile that carries both love and finality, and said, "I have a table now, and for the first time in my life I sit at the head of it." And though the words stung, he nodded, because he understood. This wasn't a punishment, it was her homecoming. He stayed the night in town, not in her cottage but nearby, and they had breakfast the next morning, eggs and toast and quiet laughter. And when he left, she hugged him, not with desperation but with peace, and whispered, "You'll be okay." And this time he knew she meant both of them, and as he walked away he didn't look back, not because he was trying to forget, but because he had finally learned how to carry her forward, not as a shadow, not as guilt, but as a woman who had taught him that love, to be true, must be seen, spoken, honored. And somewhere inside her small cottage, at a table set for one, she poured herself another cup of tea, opened the window to let the light in, and smiled, because after a lifetime of being placed in the kitchen, she had finally built a home where her seat was hers, earned, sacred, and never again to be taken away.